There are approximately 500,000 people worldwide who are children of survivors of the Nazi Holocaust. Most of these children have grown up far away from the countries where their parents were raised and were subjected to that particular persecution. The majority have been raised either in the state of Israel or in America. The children of the Holocaust defy simple categorization. Some have become totally immersed in the development of a Jewish military in Israel capable of warding off latter-day Holocausts, perhaps expressing anguish or anger at a perceived lack of fighting spirit on the part of their ancestors. Others have spent years in therapy, trying to cope with the guilt at not having suffered as much as did their parents, or guilt brought on by simply having been born when their unborn cousins were never afforded that opportunity. Still others consciously block out the heritage of horror altogether and forge ahead with a new identity, totally devoid of apparent connection with Jewish victimization. Nevertheless, one can say with a reasonable amount of certainty that virtually all are bound by an awareness of certain characteristics of their heritage. All of their families have suffered great personal tragedy. All have suffered from great senses of displacement. And all realize their family trees have certain withered or dead limbs. I come before you today as one such child of the Holocaust, the only American-born member of my immediate family. My parents were born and raised in or near Berlin, where they were arrested 10 years into the Third Reich. My sister was born in Munich a year and a half after the Allies defeated Germany. By the time I was born, 8 years had passed since my parents were liberated, 3 since they had first seen the Statue of Liberty, and 2 since they had moved to Portland. I was raised in what I thought was a very American household, which is what I am sure my parents wanted for me and for my sister. My parents made a conscious decision not to speak German around the home and chose not to raise me bilingual. All along, however, I was aware that my background was different. I learned at a young age that the number tattooed on my father's arm had been put there by the Nazis. I knew my parents had been in concentration camps. I knew that the few relatives we had who had survived the war had been scattered by fate to distant parts of the earth. Unlike my friends, I never had any grandparents, another generally common denominator among the children of the Holocaust. Although I was obviously aware my parents had survived the camps, the Holocaust was not a frequent topic of conversation in our home. My sister and I learned bits and pieces about their experiences in the war, and whatever questions we asked were usually answered, though generally without much detail. We were not inundated with Holocaust stories. We were not burdened with reminders nor made to feel guilty that we had not suffered as they had. My parents were not refugees in that they did not leave Europe in the immediate aftermath of the war. My sister was 3 years old at the time, and they based their decision on the feeling that she should not be raised among Germans. To me, Germany was a symbol of my parents' suffering, of the dispersal of my relatives, and of the death of my grandparents. My father's brother, who also survived the war, moved to America afterwards and raised a family in Minnesota. His daughter, Steffi, my first cousin, decided as she approached her mid-30s to explore her roots. She took a job teaching at an American school in Berlin and moved there on a 3-year contract. She wrote me and told me of her search for her history. I felt overwhelmed with an urgency to return to the land my parents left, so I visited my cousin. There were huge gaps in my sense of my own history, and I saw a golden opportunity to fill in some of them. My visit was filled with emotionally challenging moments and experiences. I realized that I had waited almost 30 years to experience those feelings, and I wanted to make certain that I missed none. I made a conscious effort to confront the trying situations my visits would produce, and each such visit produced an element of satisfaction and an element of grief. Perhaps I was striving to acquire a sense of suffering. I did not grow up deprived of anything that was truly important or necessary. I frankly was never victimized personally by any anti-Semitic slur directed at me individually, nor was I ever discriminated against because of my Judaism. My first full day in West Berlin, I felt a strong desire to visit whatever remained of Judaism in Berlin. I found a small Jewish community center guarded by armed police. The building was hardly inviting and certainly did not exude any of the vitality that the city itself exhibits. Inside the building, I proceeded into a foyer where a wall simply listed the names of the concentration camps in a formation that represented their geographical relationship to one another. A plaque nearby dedicated itself and the center to the memory of some 60,000 Berlin Jews who had worked for the Jewish community and who died at the hands of the Nazi persecution. In West Berlin today, a city of 2.1 million people, there are only 6,500 Jews living, a tiny remnant of the community in which I might have been born and raised had history afforded that opportunity. We traveled to the outskirts of Munich and visited the concentration camp at Dachau. We knew that our parents had not been interned there, but we did not know at the time that my father had actually sung at the exercises dedicated the Dachau Memorial after the war. We toured the museum together, staring dumbfounded at the photographs of the suffering and of the dead. We had seen other similar pictures before, either in film or in books, but the powerfulness of realizing that the photographs were taken within several hundred yards of where we stood was devastating. We posed for pictures for our fathers by a monument which said in 4 languages, "Never again." As I prepared to leave Dachau, I proudly signed a registration book for visitors to the museum with my name and date and the addendum, "An American-born son of camp survivors." When we returned to Berlin, we went to visit Udenauer Straße, where our fathers were raised and where they, along with their mother and my mother, were arrested. The particular apartment building was now in a working-class Turkish immigrant neighborhood, but apparently looked much as it had when they were growing up. I had a terrific lump in my throat as I stood in the courtyard of that apartment building. More than any other time during my stay in Germany, I knew I was standing where my family had stood in times of trouble and in times of fear. Here Stephanie and I stood almost 40 years to the week after our fathers had been arrested, and we walked through the corridors of the building, trying to sense what it must have felt like to hear the sounds of the boots of the soldiers when they came looking for them. It was a moment of great triumph to be able to stand there 40 years later, and to know that my family had survived, had prospered in a new land, and had produced a child who could come back and stand in those hallways and say with pride and yet with great humility and gratefulness that we have survived, but Hitler did not. For all the emotional trauma associated with my visit to the land of my ancestors' tragedies, I seized upon another opportunity a year later to return. I tagged along when my parents decided to visit southern Germany and Munich for the first time since they had boarded a ship bound to America on appropriately the 4th of July in 1950. While in Munich, I was invited to a party celebrating the bat mitzvah of a young German Jewess. I found myself seated at a table that evening with a dozen other young adults, every one of whom was the child of survivors. None had been born in Germany, but all, with or without their parents, had made their way back. I had never interacted with so many children of survivors. I felt a tremendous bond toward them, and at the same time a great distance, because I had great difficulty accepting their decision to return to Germany to live. They explained that in many ways, They felt surrounded by an alien society that did not and could not fully appreciate how they felt as children of survivors. On the other hand, they felt it terribly important to ensure that that very culture not forget about them. And they intended to make their presence known so that they could not be forgotten. My parents and I visited the beautiful little village of Surberg, where my father had escaped from a death march and had been liberated. We visited the mass grave of the more than 60 men who remained with the march when my father left it. All were massacred by their German guards. Their individual identities remain unknown. None spoke the German language, and none were even Jewish. They were simply more victims of the Holocaust. We sat nearby that cemetery in utter silence for several very long minutes, pondering what would have been my father's unmarked grave. Finally, my mother, in barely a whisper, remarked that she never would have known anything of the fate of her husband had he been among those massacred near Surberg. Then, with a sensitivity that only a person who had known great sorrow could feel, she immediately expressed concern for the families of all those unknown men of unknown extraction lying anonymously in their unmarked graves, families who never knew when, where, if, or how their loved ones perished. My father was originally to have participated in today's program with me, but he is on his way back to Surberg, where he will speak at ceremonies later this week commemorating the victims of the war, especially those lying in that unmarked mass grave. I know his message there will be much the same as is mine here. It is because of a sense of reconciliation that I've been able to visit Germany, and my parents have been able to return to visit. Notwithstanding that reconciliation, we have not allowed ourselves to forget, to ignore, or to rewrite history in order to interchange the victims with the oppressors. These memories will not merely fade away with the passage of years or of generations, where I have stood in the hallway of the Udenauer Strasse apartment building and felt as if they were coming for me too. I have stood by the mass unmarked grave that might have precluded my very existence. I have marveled at the miracles that have made my life even possible, and that have allowed the son of survivors the opportunity to speak in a free country in the governor's mansion. But I never forget the monument at Dachau, never again. Remarks delivered at Blaine House, Augusta, Maine, April 23, 1985. Our message from 1985 is equally important and no less urgent today. My mother died in 2010, my father in 2017. From their legacy and the legacy provided by countless survivors who have shared their oral and written stories, we know we cannot hide from or ignore painful truths. Rather, we need to confront bigotry and hate when we see it, to appreciate that history, unfortunately, can repeat itself, and to take all necessary action to assure that never again becomes a reality and not a mere hope. Thank you.